Hey, and welcome back to a new video. Today I'm building a fantasy style wizard towers, I guess. I don't know, it turned out pretty cool. There are a lot of ways you could describe it. But I started with wireframing. I don't often wireframe builds, but when I do, it's probably because there are a lot of places where I can stuff up, and there are a lot of different shapes that I want to put in one build. And especially like at different heights. Here I wanted to have like a sort of like stone corridor almost between two of the towers, and it needs to intersect at like the middle of one of the sides of the towers, even though they are circles, but one of the flat sides. And so wireframing really helped me do that. It means that you can move things around until you like it with ease, rather than having to move every single block of a final product or ending it up with something that you're not happy with at the end because you can't be bothered changing it. And it's really painful to do, but it helps you so much in the end when you do it well. But for the color palette, because I think you'll notice very quickly that I use a very strange, I guess. I don't use these sort of like non-color to color gradients or color to non-color gradients. But I saw a post on Instagram that had a pink to sandstone gradient, which is not something I usually do. When I usually do a gradient, it's usually like gray, or even like just sandstone by itself, but like a neutral-ish color. And what I usually do is just go from dark to light. But going from color to less color and like from dark to light as well, is that it lifts your eye up but also makes it pop. It's one of those things that is just really cool to do. And I realized that I hadn't worked with pink in forever, so I decided to do that. And you'll also see on the screen right now that I also did a completely opposite color palette. So I went from dark gray to cyan, which is fairly opposite pink on the color spectrum. So it contrasts in that way as well. But I really like the idea that there can be good and evil coexisting or existing in the same area. And so with these towers, what I wanted to do is create one that is like stereotypically evil with dark colors and like harsher tones and like dark clouds around the top and stuff, and then one that would stereotypically look like good or like the opposite of evil, which would be like pink and like light clouds. And also what I did with the cyan color palette was I sort of started with what I usually do for like when I'm texturing in different blocks with cyan or a different color. I'd use the concrete, the wool and the concrete powder. But then I also added in warped wood to use that because I don't use that a lot. I've been trying to use the newer blocks more recently. I also use prismarine and chains and soul lanterns to give it a bit of atmosphere and some detailing as well. I didn't add a heap of detailing to this build because I think that the atmosphere and the colors were more important than intricate details, but the ones that I did add, I think added a lot to the atmosphere as well. And usually I do like a sort of colorful roof. But here I sort of made it more of a darker tone. I used nether brick, which really brought the attention to the color in the build. Sure, nether brick is colored. It's not like black or white or a shade of that. It is colored, and it contrasts okay with the cyan, but it's not something that your eye is drawn to. So you have one point of focus for each tower, and that's the color. And then you can look up with the gradient or look down with the gradient to that color or away from that color to look at the rest of the build. I also did the thing where it had like almost an exponential curve on the roof, because I think that it draws out the height very well, because if you were to make it go like the same amount each time you go in a block, it would just be really, really tall. If you were to make it a shallow slope, I think that it would look very unbalanced. Like, you could do that, but I don't think that really goes with the style that I'm going for, with the sort of wizard tower effect. And it also sort of mimics like wizards' hats as well, which is pretty cool. And then with the pink color palette, I decided to use coral. Why I decided to use pink coral, I don't know. Because it's like a darker pink, but I also had to make sure that I used water like next to every block so it didn't dry out. So I could only use that for like the bottom section of it, but then I went back into what I usually do, the concrete, the wool, and the concrete powder. And then I even added in some glazed terracotta, which I wouldn't usually add in, but I'm trying to grow my comfort zone for the blocks that I like to work with. And you'll notice that in the time lapse that me building the tower is very slow. Like, I'll do like a quarter of the build and then it'll take me like a while to do the other like quarters. And that's because I try and get the shape right for one quarter, and then I have to copy it, so every block I place, I have to go back to one side and then to the other and recreate it. And to get the right shape, if you don't get the right shape in this step, it doesn't look very good. You'll see from some of my previous builds, they look a bit like weird just proportionally, so it's really hard to get the right shape, but once you do, it looks pretty good. But it's just very time consuming. Like, this time lapse is sped up so much, and you can still probably tell that it is going pretty slow compared to all the other steps, but it's just... And when you build castles and towers especially, they need to look slightly bottom heavy but balanced out. So your brain understands that it's like able to be like that. Like, your brain won't like and enjoy something that it can't make sense of. So you need to, when you're building, it's better to build things that look plausible, that look like they're able to be done in real life without like toppling over or whatever because they're too top heavy. Unless it's like you're building something that's clearly like cartoonish and unrealistic, it will help your brain make sense of it more, and it will mean that it will probably look better overall. But yeah, the sort of theory behind this build is that like one wizard might live in one tower and one wizard might live in the other, but they still like coexist, and they can be best friends, but they're so different. Because one is obviously like the color, like I mentioned before, like the colors that you would typically associate with like the good guy in the movie, and one tower is what you'd typically associate with the bad guy. And so what it does, like, to put them next to each other and connect them specifically with like it's like a wall that goes between them, I guess. But to connect them with that is like it's sort of like posing this question of, do these people coexist? Are they the same person? that lives in both towers, just on different days of the week, maybe. But how do good and evil coexist in a space? It like we've grown up and like been introduced to the fact that good and evil are separate, and they must be separate because they're against each other. They directly contradict each other. You can't have good and evil. But I think that this build is sort of like exploring that possibility of what if they were together and what would happen. And obviously, like, you're not going to know what happens, it's not a story, but you can create a story in your head if you like. And that's what inspires me to build. I create a story for most of the builds that I create. And it sort of helps me create the right atmosphere and the right mood to know what the build is about. Helps you to sort of create the right tone. And some sort of environmental details that I don't usually add to builds here, and like atmospheric things. I added some clouds here around the build just to show that they're sort of like high up and that there is height to the build, and also just to make it, I don't know, I feel like clouds at the top of towers, they sort of like accentuate the idea that they're high up in the clouds, you know, they're above everything else. And I tried to match these to the color palette, so the cyan and grey tower had light grey clouds, and the other one had white clouds, just to continue with that trend. And also the floating candles, I was inspired by Grian's Season 8 base with the floating candles, because they do add a lot of atmosphere, and I think that they're a really great addition. And I always add greenery and landscaping to, almost always landscaping, but always greenery to my builds. But usually I do it like before if I'm doing landscaping, but here I decided to do it afterwards because I feel like if I did it before, I'd create a whole mountain range and it would sort of overpower the build that I was trying to create. And when I did it afterwards, it sort of helped me to make it complement the build and like have the build, the landscaping fit around the build, so that it could look like the towers were quite old and that everything had sort of formed around it. It also, like I said before, it helps with the scale, so I could sort of scale the landscape to how big I made the towers, because otherwise it would just overpower it, or it'd make tiny cliffs and a big tower, and I didn't want that. So it's helpful sometimes to make the build first and create the scale for that, and then to create everything else. And I also added some trees around and whatnot, and some flower patches, which is my new favorite way to make it look natural. And here's the final build. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, leave a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more of this sort of content, and I will see you very soon for another video.